This is also a time of change for my family.
The silence in the halls of Windsor Castle had never felt so heavy, a suffocating stillness that preceded a storm capable of tearing down centuries of tradition. King Charles III, a man who had spent a lifetime preparing for the weight of the crown, found himself staring at a cream-colored envelope that should never have reached his desk. It was a cold Tuesday morning in May when the first crack in his world appeared, not through an external enemy, but from the very heart of his private life. The documents inside were not mere administrative reports. They were the blueprints of a shadow empire being built within his own palace. For months, under the guise of modernization and family support, a subtle web of influence had been woven by the person he trusted most, Queen Camilla. The king's eyes traced the elegant script of internal memos, revealing a systematic effort to infiltrate the monarchy's core operations. It wasn't just about minor favors or social standing. It was a calculated move to position Camilla's daughter, Laura Lopes, into a role of unprecedented authority, a role traditionally reserved for those of direct royal blood. As Charles read through the secret correspondence, the realization hit him like a physical blow. His wife, the woman who had stood by him through decades of public scrutiny, was playing a dangerous game of chess with the future of the throne. Every afternoon tea, every quiet conversation about streamlining the royal estate, now appeared in a new, sinister light. She had used her influence to bypass the long-standing protocols that his mother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, had protected with her life. The king felt the walls of his study closing in as he uncovered records of private meetings between Camilla and key officials of the royal estates, meetings that were never entered into the official diary. These were not accidental oversights, they were deliberate acts of subversion. The documents detailed how loyal staff members in Prince William's communication office were being subtly pressured to include Laura in national events, creating a fact on the ground that would eventually become an irreversible precedent. Charles stood by the window, looking out at the sprawling gardens, but all he could see was the erosion of the institution he was sworn to protect. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was institutional. By trying to elevate her own bloodline into the inner circle, Camilla was threatening the very foundation of the direct line of succession. The king knew that a monarch cannot afford the luxury of blind emotion. He ordered a secret investigation, a task force of his most trusted and ancient advisors to dig deeper into the shadows. What they found was even more alarming, a draft decree, hidden in a secure server, that would have granted Laura a symbolic role in Scottish ceremonies, a role that would have effectively made her a quasi-royal. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. It showed a complete disregard for the boundaries that keep the monarchy stable. As the evidence piled up, emails, recorded whispers of concerned courtiers, and financial reallocations, the king's heart hardened. The man who had once been known for his sensitivity was now replaced by a sovereign who understood that mercy for one could mean the downfall of the many. He spent long nights in the library, the only sound the scratching of his pen as he cross-referenced the betrayals. He realized that Camilla had been using her knowledge of his own vulnerabilities to mask her movements. She knew his desire for family harmony, and she had used that harmony as a shield for her ambition. The tension in the palace became palpable. Even the walls seemed to sweat with the secret of the king's fury. He had to decide whether to confront the woman he loved or protect the crown he wore. There was no middle ground. The stability of William and Catherine's future was at stake. If he allowed this infiltration to continue, the monarchy would no longer be a sacred institution of duty, but a playground for personal nepotism. The weight of his ancestors seemed to press down on his shoulders, demanding a response that was both swift and absolute. He realized that the crown on his head was not just a symbol of power, but a mandate of protection. Every page he turned in the black folder of evidence was a nail in the coffin of his trust. He saw the signatures, the quiet approvals, and the strategic silence of those who had been compromised by Camilla's charm. The time for quiet disappointment was over. The time for a king's justice had arrived. He called for his private secretary in the dead of night, his voice a low growl that carried the chill of the Scottish Highlands. The order was simple: prepare for a journey to Scotland, and ensure that the Princess of Wales is ready for a responsibility she never saw coming. The storm was no longer approaching, it had arrived, and Charles was ready to be the lightning. The atmosphere at Birkhall, the king's private residence in Scotland, was thick with a chilling frost that had nothing to do with the outside weather. Inside the drawing room, the fireplace crackled, but the warmth seemed to die before it could reach the center of the room where King Charles III stood waiting. He was no longer the husband who looked for comfort in Camilla's eyes. He was the sovereign holding a black folder that contained the death of their shared trust. When Camilla entered, she carried her usual grace, a mask of composure she had perfected over decades, but it faltered the moment she saw the king's silhouette against the dim light. There were no greetings, no customary glass of wine, only a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Charles did not speak at first. He simply placed the folder on the mahogany table with a sharp, echoing thud. The sound was a declaration of war. As he began to spread the documents, the secret emails, the unauthorized budget reallocations for Lopes, and the intercepted plans for the Scottish takeover, Camilla's face transformed from confusion to a pale, brittle mask of realization. She tried to offer a defense, her voice trembling with the practiced tone of a mother merely looking out for her child's dignity, but the king cut her off with a single icy stare. He laid out the evidence of how she had manipulated the staff in William and Catherine's household, an act he considered a supreme betrayal of the direct line of succession. This was the moment the man Charles died and the king took full control. The confrontation lasted for hours, a brutal exchange of cold facts against desperate justifications. Charles pointed out that by trying to build a parallel power structure for her daughter, Camilla had violated the very sanctity of the crown she wore. The most devastating blow came when the king revealed he had already moved to freeze all the personnel changes she had initiated. He wasn't just asking for an explanation, he was delivering a verdict. The internal purge had begun. Within 48 hours, the king's most loyal enforcers had swept through the administrative offices, removing those who had secretly pledged loyalty to Camilla's shadow agenda. It was a silent execution of influence. Behind the scenes, the palace was in a state of shock as high-ranking officials were suddenly reassigned or forced into early retirement. Charles remained isolated, his heart hardened by the necessity of survival. He realized that the crown required a sacrifice, and that sacrifice would be the very woman who had been his sanctuary. The climax of this internal war occurred in a locked meeting room at Balmoral, where the king summoned the senior members of the royal council. Camilla was forced to attend, stripped of her usual seat of honor, standing instead as a subject under scrutiny. In a move that would send shockwaves through the history books, Charles presented a formal document of renunciation. He demanded that Camilla sign a permanent agreement to cease all involvement in the management of royal titles and to acknowledge the illegality of her lobbying efforts. The tension was so high that one advisor later described the air as electric with the scent of a collapsing era. Camilla looked at the crown jewels displayed in a glass case nearby, the very symbols she had tried to leverage for her daughter's future, and realized they were now beyond her reach forever. The king's voice, when he finally spoke the sentence, was devoid of emotion, a cold mechanical resonance that left no room for negotiation. He informed her that her right to use specific royal symbols, including the historic crown she wore during Scottish ceremonies, was being revoked effective immediately. This was a symbolic deposition, a public stripping of power within the private walls of the monarchy. The betrayal had been met with a response so absolute that it left Camilla's ambitions in ashes. As the meeting concluded, the king did not look back at his wife. He stood alone, a figure of solitary power, knowing that the next step was to transfer that reclaimed authority to the one person who had earned it through silent duty, Catherine. The purge was complete, the traitors were removed, and the stage was now set for a historic shift that would redefine the United Kingdom's future. The king had chosen the throne over the heart, and in doing so, he had ensured that the shadow of Lopes would never darken the halls of power again. The grey skies over Edinburgh seemed to part just as the royal motorcade arrived at the doors of the Scottish Parliament. Inside, the air was still and sacred, far removed from the bustling streets of the city. This was not a public spectacle for the cameras. It was a surgical restoration of divine order. King Charles III stood at the center of the chamber, his posture rigid, reflecting the gravity of a man who had just excised a cancer from his own home. Opposite him stood Catherine, the Princess of Wales, dressed in a garment of deep emerald that matched the rugged landscapes of the Highlands she was about to represent. There was no fanfare, no thousands of invited guests, only the silent witnesses of the Scottish state and Prince William, whose presence was like an unyielding fortress behind his wife. The king reached for the velvet box that had once been associated with Camilla's authority in these northern lands. As he opened it, the diamonds caught the light of the antique chandeliers, sparking with a brilliance that seemed to cleanse the room of the recent scandals. Charles looked at Catherine, and for the first time in 10 days, a flicker of warmth returned to his eyes. He wasn't just giving her a title, he was handing her the shield of the monarchy. When he pronounced the words, naming her sovereign of Scotland. His voice resonated with a power that shook the very foundations of the hall. He took the crown, the same crown he had stripped from Camilla in the bitter shadows of Balmoral, and held it high. In that movement, the transfer of destiny was complete. As the metal touched Catherine's hair, a visible current of relief swept through the gathered advisers. This was the moment the monarchy stabilized. Catherine did not flinch under the weight. She accepted it with a grace that silenced any doubt about her readiness. She was no longer just a supportive wife in the background. She was now an independent pillar of the throne, a monarch in her own right over the Scottish realm. The king stepped back, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect that signaled to the world, even if the world wasn't watching yet, that the era of shadow plots was over. The silence that followed was not one of tension, but of peace. Outside, the winds of the Highlands continued to blow, but inside, the direct line of succession had been fortified with iron and gold. Catherine looked toward the future with eyes that had seen the cost of betrayal and the price of duty. She knew that this crown was a burden as much as an honor, a promise to keep the sanctity of the bloodline pure from the ambitions of outsiders. As the small group filed out of the chamber, the king walked beside William, a silent passing of the torch between generations. The purge was a memory, the judgment was final, and the new sovereign of Scotland stood as a testament to the king's ultimate choice, that the crown must always come before the heart. The internal war was won, and as the heavy oak doors closed behind them, the monarchy emerged not just intact, but reborn under the light of a new, unwavering star. Was this act of stripping one queen to crown another a cold-blooded punishment, or the only way to save the British Empire from its own internal shadows? One thing was certain: the story of the Scottish Parliament that night would be whispered in the halls of power for centuries to come.